Last video, we left off talking about taxes in competitive goods markets. We showed that the effects are identical whether we impose the tax on the buyer or the seller. So instead, we simplified our model using a tax wedge. All this took place within an environment where national borders didn't matter. This video will be somewhat unique in this class. We're going to consider a simple modification to our supply and demand model with taxes, in which we have a domestic market where we can import and export goods. And we're covering this model because to really understand it requires understanding both quantities and prices for both buyers and sellers as they move independently. This class isn't really about international trade, but in many ways this model captures many of the relationships we've left unrelated. We worked with price controls, where we set a legal interval of prices, which meant quantity supplied and quantity demanded differed. And we set taxes, where the buyer's price and the seller's price differed. In this model, we're going to flex both these muscles simultaneously. So first, let's set up our domestic market of supply and demand. This gives us a domestic price and quantity. But what happens if we open our domestic market to the world? And we're going to make an assumption here. We're going to say that our domestic market is small relative to the rest of the world. This essentially means that our domestic buyers and sellers don't impact global prices in any significant way. Relative to domestic prices, the world price, which will denote PW, can either be higher, lower, or equal to our domestic price. If the world price is above the domestic price, instead of selling domestically, sellers can sell internationally and do better. So no seller will want to sell at a price below the global price, which will denote with PG. Since the price is higher, the quantity supplied will also be higher. But this change in seller behavior impacts the domestic market too. Buyers can now buy from the world market, but since the world price is above the domestic price, buyers receive no benefit from the international market. In fact, domestic sellers are no longer willing to sell at a price below the global price. So buyers now face the global price domestically as well. Since the price is now higher, quantity demanded falls. Since sellers are selling to the world market, they're able to sell more than the domestic quantity demanded. This is what we call exports. And this is true at a range of prices. Then if the global price is below the domestic price, buyers can buy off the global market instead of the domestic market, since the global price is better. This means sellers cannot sell at a price above the global price, and in fact must sell at the global price on the domestic market. And this is true at a range of prices. So what you can see is that incentives for the buyers and sellers push the domestic price to be equal to the global price. And the difference in quantity supplied and quantity demanded at this price is what we call imports or exports. This concept sort of rhymes with our model of price controls, except the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded is compensated for by the global market with imports and exports, instead of having an excess or a shortage. Welfare in this model probably works with your intuition, where before we constrained surplus to the region above quantity exchanged, we now have two quantities, one for sellers and one for buyers. As before, to find consumer surplus, we look at the area below the demand curve, above the price, and inside the quantity bought. And to find producer surplus, we look at the area above the supply curve, below the price, and inside the quantity sold. At this point, there's no government revenue or deadweight loss. Here one can see that opening the domestic market to trade increases total surplus. In this model, let's introduce a tax on international trade, a tariff. A tariff is typically imposed on imports, goods purchased internationally and brought domestically, but exports can be tariffed and imports from countries importing these goods can be tariffed, which is essentially a tariff on exports domestically. So what happens when we impose a tariff on imports? Since buyers now face the global price, but the tariff is now included, the price buyers face is now higher, and by the amount of the tariff. This increases the seller's price as well. Both changes are reflected in consumer surplus and producer surplus in ways you would expect. But we've also introduced government revenue. The government is receiving a tariff on each item being imported. So we multiply the imports by the tariff to find the government revenue. And in an earlier video, I promised deadweight loss isn't always as simple as a triangle, and this is one example of where that happens. Here, deadweight loss, the loss in total surplus relative to maximum total surplus or efficiency, is the area above the lost quantity, which happens to be lost imports, and between the demand curve and the price, and between the supply curve and the price. And this model applies to an export tariff as well in a similar way. The domestic price is the global price with the tariff, which gives us producer and consumer surplus. Government revenue is a tariff times the exports, and deadweight loss is the lost surplus, which is the area above lost exports between the price and the demand curve and between the price and the supply curve.